Hello my friends. You have to excuse me today, I haven't shaved, the chronic fatigue syndrome is bad, I hardly slept, but I just want to record the next part, the third part of chapter 1 of my book. You remember that Gus had gone off to find water, he'd found some, he'd come back and brought the water to Belle. Here was the situation. The poor girl looked wretched, and Gus hoped she had no serious injury. He felt very strongly that he didn't want to be misunderstood. If he started to check for her wounds and she came round, how was that going to look? Yet he knew that really she needed to be checked. He couldn't do much about that till she woke up, so he decided that the next essential was fire. True, they would need food, but he wasn't hungry, not after visiting the crash site. And Belle was sleeping, but fire would be useful. It would give light at night. It would enable them to cook food. He could boil the water, which might help to ensure that it was safe for them to use. Perhaps it would lead to the animals being scared off at night. Who knew what lived in this dense forest land that stretched for thousands of miles? Of course, Gus couldn't boil water in a plastic container, but he had to get a fire and then find what else he could use at the disaster spot. Is there anyone else? That thought kept coming into his mind, but he'd seen no evidence of anybody. He didn't know what to do, and he decided there was not much he could do. He looked at Belle. Her breathing was slow, heavy, but even. He put his hand on her forehead. It was far too hot. He looked down at her arms and her legs. Of course, she was just dressed in a t-shirt and jeans, but he was glad that at least she had a good stout pair of boots on. He remembered the conversation between Duncan and her on the plane, and the way they'd been intending to follow the bank of a river where there was a rough track, which he'd been assured would eventually bring him to the research centre in the rainforest where his friend worked, and they would be able to stay there and spend some time there. Poor Duncan, Gus thought. Those plans were gone for good. Gus himself was feeling pretty fit. His head hurt a bit, but apart from that he was okay. He decided that he had to use the time well. Daylight only lasted for so long. So first he gathered some wood, dry, dead wood, as much as he could without moving far from Belle. Then he headed off along the ridge again, past the stream and to the crash site. He found a small sheet of metal about 3 feet by 8 inches. He set forth to work putting combustible material on it, and then walked toward the smouldering undergrowth where the front of the plane had all but burned out. He lifted a piece of wood that still had a red glow to it, put it on the metal sheet, and blew gently until he could put a couple of small sticks around it and they started to burn. Soon he had a small fire on the metal, so he started to walk back. He was almost back to the ridge, back to the stream, when the metal started to burn his fingers, and he cursed his stupidity. Putting the metal down on the ground, he thought, and then he went to the stream, gathered some of the mud, put in a handful in each palm, and then went back to the tray and edged it slightly over the ridge. Now, with the wet mud between his hands and the metal, he could cope. He edged the other hand under a stick, a spark hitting him on the cheek. He felt the burn, but carried on walking along the ridge. The heat was getting to be too much. He had to put the metal down once and go back to the stream to get fresh mud. He noticed this mud was very pliable and sticky. At last he arrived back with his fire. Soon he had a campfire going and gathered more firewood to feed it. After checking that the young one was still sleeping, he made the ridgeway trip once more, trying to find what else might be useful. Checking a little for evidence of survivors, he paused to look for the first time around the entire crash site. It was in 2 parts. The back of the plane was still hanging in a tree clump, about 10 meters above the ground, hanging precariously as if refusing to obey gravity completely for the last few feet. He tried to ignore the numerous bodies hanging in the trees, on the ground, in various states. Death had never upset him too much. Birth, life, death. He accepted that as what seemed to be the natural cycle, just like the dawn, the day, the night. He looked at his watch. It was an old timepiece. He preferred old things, watches that wound. He'd avoided the liquid crystal displays and even watches that needed a battery to turn hands. They weren't the real thing. Gus liked to preserve the old things of bygone ages. However, his watch had stopped at 2:41 and 18 seconds. Shockproof obviously did not include plane crash proof. And though the winder turned, there was no response to the hands. Gus found it moving that the time was frozen at the point of impact here among these bodies. He paused and looked at the twisted features of the poor nun hanging upside down in a tree. Yes, he'd noticed her and another nun boarding the plane. Gus had been put off organised religion long ago, and he didn't exactly view this nun as more worthy of survival than anyone else on the plane. It just seemed to him that if there was a great hand from above in the way things worked out, well, maybe the nun could have been in more benefit to others than he would be. Again he asked, why? There's no justice, he thought. The face of the nun, far from serene, seemed to supply him with no answers. Gus had a chance of seeing that he and Belle could survive. His past had given him that. Maybe they would be rescued, maybe not. However, Gus knew that in his old German mind he had preservation instincts and a clear idea of how to survive anywhere. If he was alone, he wouldn't have cared much. After so many years, did his rescue really matter? He'd endured so much so long, and now it seemed survival? Well, maybe he'd already seen enough. But he wasn't alone. A young lady was probably dependent on his knowledge and skills in order that she could survive and live on through her life. It was a long time since anyone had needed him, and even amid the carnage of the wrecked plane and squandered lives, he felt a little bit more valuable than previously. Maybe that is why I survived, he whispered. Some of what he saw made him feel sick, and he knew it would join wartime memories that still gave him nightmares sometimes. Besides the bodies, there was a lot of human effects. He knew he would have to come and plunder as much as was useful in the days ahead, but he made a vow. The young lady, she must never see this plane. He knew all too well the effects death and carnage had on a young mind. So where is her man? Gus addressed the air hostess lying at his feet. He hoped she was unmarried, but he didn't look to see if she had a ring, feeling that the sorrow of parents might be just as great as that of a husband or a fiancé. No category of human has a monopoly on grief after a disaster, he reasoned. He knew that this was not a place to come too often, but tomorrow he must gather up everything he could, because this would become a place of disease in this heat. He knew he must find Duncan, a young man, to help his young girl. In the towel section, Gus told himself. He managed to climb a little way up a tree, one of those in which the stubborn, gravity-resisting rear end of the broken plane hung. Not high. He got maybe 12 feet. A loud shriek from the forest alarmed Gus for a few seconds. Then he talked to himself. This is the rain's forest, Gus. You know it will be full of these strange sounds of birds and creatures. He looked into the wreckage suspended beside him. The faces were red. A vine of some kind brushed across his face, and he recovered from the sight inside the plane's remains. First of all, there were folk nearest, faces looking like melted plastic, like dolls that a child had placed in the hearth of an old-fashioned coal fire. Polythene dolls that had been charged by the heat, from beautiful features to grotesque masks. Horrors from somewhere beyond human, somewhere beyond real, yet real enough to quicken the heartbeat. As Gus stepped inside, the floor creaked and everything swayed a little. The black American businessman was covered in charred remains of his own attaché case. Papers, great deals that only had to be finished, fortunes to be made. Gus remembered that this once handsome corpse seemed to be no more than 40. The wedding ring on his finger and the one that was diamond studded beside it were like the charred papers, of no value to him now. More to follow soon, my friends. I really appreciate it if you're listening to this. I don't want anybody to be bored, but I do appreciate those who make the time to listen. I just feel there's no point in writing if you don't share it. It's really nice to have your taking notice, and I'll share some more soon. Bye bye for now. Bye everybody. Bye.